Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Edward Siecienski. I am the Clement and Helen Pappas Professor of Byzantine Civilization and Religion at Stockton University in New Jersey. And I have the pleasure today of introducing Dr. Jeff Brubaker, author of the Disputatio of the Latins and the Greeks, 1234, Introduction, Translation, and Commentary. Dr. Brubaker received his BA in History from the Texas Christian University and his MA from the University of Texas at Arlington before completing his PhD at the University of Birmingham in 2016. Since then, he has been serving as adjunct instructor of history at Canisius College and several other institutions. Jeff's work on diplomatic and ecclesiastical dialogue between the Latin West and the Byzantine East in the years following the Fourth Crusade has earned him invitations to speak at several prestigious international gatherings, such as the 2016 Contra Latinos et Adversus Grecos conference in Venice, where I first had the pleasure of meeting him. His published works include articles such as You Are the Heretics, Dialogue and Disputation between the Greek East and Latin West after 1204, and The Diplomacy of Theological Debate, the Friars' Report, the Disputatio of 1234. Currently, he is working on multiple projects involving cross-cultural meetings in the medieval Mediterranean, as well as the intersection of political and ecclesiastical matters in Byzantium. The book, which Jeff kindly allowed me to see before publication so that I could use it in my own work, contains almost 100 pages of introductory material, giving both the historical and theological information necessary to understand the people, issues, and geopolitics involved in the debate. The two biggest theological issues at stake, the Latins' use of azymes and the filioque, are placed beside the questions of papal authority, imperial legitimacy for ecumenical dialogue in the 13th century. Dr. Brubaker then provides a translation of several letters to and from Patriarch Germanos before getting to the 1234 debate between the Franciscan friars and the Byzantine delegates, one of the key exchanges between Latins and Greeks during this period. The fact that these texts now have an outstanding English translation is something for which Byzantinists should be remarkably thankful. And so, without further ado, I introduce Dr. Brubaker to speak more about the book.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you to Petros and everyone involved in organizing for inviting me, putting this together. Just very quickly, everybody see the screen okay? If we get off without any technical issues, I'm serious, I'm going to go buy a lottery ticket this afternoon. I'll be very surprised. So hopefully everybody's hearing me, seeing everything all right. If you're like me, you work in crusade studies, in the history of church schism, you've probably read a great deal about why Byzantines and Latins, East and West Mediterranean, why they drift apart, especially in matters of religion. We asked what led the Greek and Roman churches into schism. When did this division happen? How do the phenomena of the Crusades impact the manner in which these two people understand themselves, but also one another, their sense of faith as separate and alien from the other, from East or West? This line of research tends to focus on pivotal figures such as the Patriarch Photius, Michael Carolarius, Cardinal Humbert, so forth. But rarely do we give adequate attention, consideration to attempts to heal that schism, to heal the division of the churches. These episodes of dialogue, or how I refer to them, disputatio, are remarkably frequent, and they force us to consider new questions. How did the two sides go about efforts to heal the schism of the churches? What were their motivations in these episodes of dialogue? And what obstacles stood before reunion? And what did the parties expect of these efforts, of these encounters? What did they look forward to as an outcome? Scholars, modern scholars, to put it lightly, have overlooked the potential for success in these negotiations, what these attempts at church union wanted to bring about. They characterize these encounters as relatively insignificant. Encounters, negotiations, they characterize as neither side taking seriously. These conclusions are common in the history of these dialogues, the history of disputatio, the history of church union negotiation. I like to pick on folks who aren't around anymore to defend themselves, so I'll refer to the almost century-old work of Louis Brayer, who described the history of church union negotiations as one of continued mortification, repeated checks, perpetual failures. This is a typical, very common characterization of this literature, of this material, of these events, right? This is kind of doomed to fail. The probably more well-known characterization is that of Sir Stephen Runciman, who pointed out that it's something of a fallacy to expect that that if we come together and discuss things, argue it out, as Admiral Cameron would characterize, that we could come to some sort of reconciliation. Runciman argues the opposite. He argues the more we argue over these issues, the more we debate them, the more ingenious, the more creative we get at finding new ways to confound one another. These conclusions overlook the nuances of the encounters of the Disputatio. Most importantly, they fail to take into account what the parties hope to gain. What did they hope would be the result? And I find this overlook, this neglect, most troubling when we think about numbers, when we think about how often the Disputatio, the dialogue over church union, happens. To stick with Louis Brayer, again, about 100 years ago or so, he added up what he thought were all the church union negotiations, all the Disputatio of the last 400 years of Byzantine history until 1453. And he found about 30 episodes of dialogue, 30 encounters in which the two sides come together and try to resolve their differences. My math is a little bit different. I'm not sure what his criteria was. Maybe my criteria for what counts as a Disputatio, what counts as an episode of church dialogue, maybe it's more liberal. But I found over 30 such encounters in a much smaller time frame. From 1054 to 1274, the Union of Lyon, I found 33 episodes of Disputatio, 33 episodes in which the Byzantines and Latins tried to resolve their religious differences. Of these 33 meetings, 21, almost 2/3, took place after the Fourth Crusade, after 1204. And this is remarkable. We might imagine the sacking of Constantinople by crusaders from the West as being a definitive nail in the coffin of schism, right? This is never going to go back. Instead, we find the Fourth Crusade, 1204, we find this serves as an impetus. We find that episodes of church union, of Disputatio, increase dramatically, and they increase in a relatively short period. Again, if we take a more narrow focus of this quantitative analysis, we find a full third, about 13 of these Disputatio, church union negotiations, a third of these total number in this period, take place only a few decades after the Fourth Crusade. From 1204 to 1234, there's 13 separate meetings in which the representatives of the two churches come together and try to heal the schism, try to end this division. These numbers alone, again, they're quite remarkable. They force us to ask why negotiation towards church union became so urgent, became so frequent after the Fourth Crusade. How do the parties go about this dialogue? Why did the frequency of these meetings end so abruptly after 1234? They pick up after 1204, but after 1234, they largely dissipate. Clearly, 1234 stands as a pivotal meeting in the history of the Disputatio, a pivotal meeting, a pivotal time in the history of the relationship of these two peoples and these two churches. We're fortunate, therefore, that we have a great deal of material, more source material survives from this encounter than from any other similar episode of the 13th century. The texts include the preliminary correspondence between Pope Gregory IX and Patriarch Germanus II, and culminates in the text of the report made by the friars who acted as papal representatives. All of this is included in English translation in my volume. I'll point out, you'll see the second note there on the list, Nicephorus Remedies Autobiographia and his treatise. Those are referenced in my text. The treatise on the procession of the Holy Spirit is included into Latin translation, a fascinating chapter, fascinating section of the book. But largely the Greek is referenced, is utilized in my translations, but I'm focusing in this volume on the Latin of the friars, as I'll describe more going forward. I hope that by making this text available to a wider audience and including full commentary, full introduction, that we can come to see how crucial the Disputatio of 1234 was and come to new conclusions, new questions. Clearly, this meeting was obviously crucial for ecclesiastical relations, how the two churches came together. Certainly that is the case. But these texts are also important for understanding of politics, diplomacy, cross-cultural confrontations in this critical period of 1204, 1261, the period of so-called exile for Byzantine history, the Byzantine state. All too often, scholars quote a mere snippet from these texts, from the report of the friars of 1244, the report of the papal representatives. A lot of historians, I'm sure many of you have studied this, have come across it already. They reference a comical phrase that's become well known to those who work in this field. As the friars left the final meeting of the Disputatio, the final negotiation with the patriarch and his clergy, they shouted back to the Greeks, "We found you heretics and excommunicates." To which the Greeks, of course, quite creatively respond, "No, you are the heretics." And that is the end of the official Disputatio. This phrase, this quote, gets a lot of attention, and a number of scholars, a number of historians have seen fit simply to cite this section and note that the whole thing comes to nothing, and so it's not required or doesn't require our full attention. I find that when we analyze the whole of their text, the whole of the report of this exchange, the Disputatio of 1234, we put it into greater context, and we gain a fuller understanding of what was at stake in 1234 and what the parties did to prepare what they hoped would come of the exchange. We see the parties hope to achieve a great deal. We gain a great insight into the foreign policy of John III Vatatzes, certainly the most dynamic and energetic of all the Byzantine rulers in this period of exile in the early 13th century. We see clearly that the disputants were not merely going through the motions of theological debate, but they had made a genuine effort. Many of them, I argue, clearly hope to achieve some progress, if not see a fuller movement towards church union. Now, I want to resist going through kind of a step-by-step of what's involved in the book. The table of contents is available if you're interested in finding out. I'm sure you can find it online with no problem. But I do want to offer some snippets or some examples of how this text, especially the report of the friars who negotiate on behalf of the Pope, I want to show how this can be useful to scholars of any number of areas, fields, interests. The texts in this volume hold a great deal of material that should interest a wide variety of scholars. The report of the friars sheds light on concepts of group identity, cross-cultural interactions. Western scholasticism is certainly integrated into a lot of their ideas. Those working in Crusade studies certainly will find this text valuable. Court dynamics and political theory in Byzantium are constantly kind of bubbling under the surface. The friars make it pretty clear that the Pope, the Patriarch and the Emperor aren't always on the same page. They're pursuing different agendas. There's information here on cities, on communities, their makeup, landmarks. And there's even information here on travel literature. So I want to just very briefly provide some ideas, some little examples of how this text, again, taken in a whole, might be useful for various people, various areas of study. One of my favorite examples, my favorite episodes from the report of the friars comes very early in the text. It's an example of the story of the so-called Weeping Latin. Shortly after they arrive in Nicaea for the first round of talks with Germanos, with the Patriarch, the friars, acting as papal representatives, are provided with a church, a facility in which to hold services in the Latin rite. The friars state in their report that a great many Latins residing in the Byzantine capital, the capital of exile in Nicaea, came to attend the service. This is sort of strange. It sort of comes out of nowhere. The friars say that there are all these Latins in Nicaea, and they all come out to attend the Latin Mass. This offers us a rare and provocative glimpse into kind of a strange scenario in which Latins are living, working, probably in service to the Byzantine emperor, only a few short years, a few decades after the Fourth Crusade. It seems contradictory, but we have it almost as a matter of fact being portrayed here by the friars in 1234. And this episode gives us one of the more unusual, more notable exchanges and encounters in the text. The friars tell us of a certain lamenting and weeping Latin who came to them after the service. They came to the friars. He complains that his own priests had punished him for attending a Latin Mass. This, again, very matter-of-factly put forth very little explanation on the part of the friars. His own priests had punished him for attending the Latin Mass. Clearly, this Latin, this weeping Latin in question, was not only working in Nicaea, working for the Byzantines, presumably in some fashion, but he was attending Greek services. He was attending services in the Greek church. Perhaps he was even bilingual. Perhaps he understood Greek. We don't, again, the friars don't give us all the context we might want, but it's a wonderful snippet. His Greek priests had apparently been offended when his parishioner attended a service in the Latin Rite, and suggests a remarkably fluid line between group structures, between Latins and Greeks, again, even in this provocative period after the Fourth Crusade. So there's a great deal here for cross-cultural exchange in the medieval Mediterranean, for how peoples come together, live together, or maybe don't get along, however you want to interpret this. Another use for this text, for this document, an excellent use, one that I think should be highlighted more often going forward, is travel and travel literature. The friars make two journeys in this text from Constantinople to these negotiations, to the Disputatio with the Greek church and the Greek patriarch. First, it takes place in Nicaea, then they go back to Constantinople, they come back again for a second round in Nymphaeon. The friars don't describe their first trip, how they get from Constantinople to Nicaea, but their second trip to the second phase of the talks in Nymphaeon, the friars offer an extremely detailed account of their journey from Constantinople to Nymphaeon. They describe where they stayed. They describe how long it took to get from place to place. They give us very exact descriptions of stops and duration of travel. Their narrative is fascinating. It's remarkably smooth transportation. It stands in sharp contrast to other narratives of travel in this period after the Fourth Crusade. Nicholas Mesrites quite famously makes a couple of trips between Constantinople and Nicaea in the years after 1204. And to say it simply, they don't go quite as well. It doesn't travel as comfortably. There are stories of pirates, grumpy merchants, things like that. And you don't find that in the friars' account. The travel is very open, very free. They never speak of danger or difficulties. The thing that annoys them most is their hosts seem to keep changing the destination. They keep going from place to place, expecting to find the emperor and the patriarch, but he's always somewhere else. So you have to keep going is sort of the idea. Their journey, their description of their journey is certainly fascinating, certainly important. And it makes us ask, why do they describe this second journey? Why describe the second phase, how they get to the second phase of the talks and not the first? Clearly, there's something that they're trying to do in the text. They're trying to show what they're going through to try to accommodate their Greek hosts and how obstinate they're being, right? Scheming Greeks is sort of the motif that comes across here. The journey comprises the journey from after this meeting, after the second phase, from Nymphaeon back to Constantinople when the Disputatio is concluded. This description concludes the friars' report. The Disputatio is ended, and they remark about being escorted back to Constantinople. And this episode comprises the final words, final comments of the friars' report. It doesn't culminate with them reaching the papal court. It doesn't end with them reaching the Latin stronghold of Constantinople. Instead, the friars conclude their report with an anecdote of a representative from Patriarch Germanos who apparently had come to meet them. Apparently, after they left Nymphaeon, the friars took some things they weren't supposed to. The text says that the representative from the Greek church wanted to secure from the friars some documents that the Greeks had provided to them through the course of the negotiations. Apparently, the allegation from the friars is that the Greeks were embarrassed by the things they said in these documents, and they wanted the evidence back. They didn't want it to be shared with the Pope or shared with anyone else. The friars allege that the patriarch was ashamed of what was contained in these documents, and that's why he sends a representative of the Cartophylax to come and take them. They refuse to surrender these documents, and according to their description, the friars were not only compelled to surrender these texts, but they were strip searched in order to produce the documents. They talk about how they were taken into a home, taken separately, right, into a residence here by the Cartophylax, who proceeded to search them and then undo the ropes. This pretty clearly to me refers to the ropes around the robes of the friars. Franciscan Dominican friar, their attire is often well known. The ropes are thought to be, right, putting the robes together. So when he says the Cartophylax undid the ropes, the allegation here to me is that they were forced to disrobe in order to find the text. I point this out because I got a lot of pushback in this translation. Some folks, so again, who I'm very grateful for their time. They looked at the translation. they were a little bit reticent to refer to a strip search in the 13th century, but it seems pretty evident to me that this is what's happening, right? The friars are trying to portray, they're trying to show the inhospitable nature of their hosts, of the Greeks, right? And all they have to go through in order to bring this meeting into fruition. Certainly, though, the most useful aspect of these translations of this text is what it reveals about ecclesiastical relations between the Greek and Roman churches in the years following the Fourth Crusade. The correspondence between Pope and Patriarch reveal a great deal of optimism and a possibility perhaps for some resolution, especially in regards to the issue of azymes. Both sides seem conciliatory. They seem open to possible ideas, possible ways forward to a compromise. The report of the friars gives a detailed account of the dialogue. The disputants employ any number of methods to win over their opponents. They employ philosophical, syllogistic method, patristic reference to prove the validity of their arguments. Really a fascinating text, fascinating example of how the two sides see their arguments going to some sort of positive conclusion, how they think they'll win over their opponents. There's a great deal we could say about the theological debates. I know some folks avoid this sort of text because they don't want to get into that sort of thing. But again, I think if we look at these snippets, these episodes, we find a great deal of value, not just for church matters, for ecclesiastical issues, but also for politics and political developments and relations in 13th century Byzantium. My favorite example is the role of the Emperor Vatatzes. He takes an active role in the Disputatio. He's often engaged. He's often making suggestions, right, on his own part. One of the most fascinating here comes towards the end of the Disputatio when he offers a compromise, a very pragmatic compromise, perhaps even one that would suggest trading the filioque, the procession problem, for the problem of leaven versus unleavened bread, azymes, right? Well, there are two things that bother us, and we'll follow you one way, you follow us the other way, and we'll all call it quits. We'll all say we all did great. Of course, it doesn't happen that way, but it shows a great deal of how Byzantines, Latins saw the problem, how they might solve this problem, how they understood what divided them. There's a lot I could say about the origins of this project. Again, forgive me because I'm going to leave a great number of people out. I'm ignoring the clock. I knew Ed would let me, so I don't want to take too much time. But I do have to point out a few people for my, express my gratitude for their contributions. Certainly, my supervising professor at Birmingham, the late Dr. Ruth McCready's, deserves tremendous gratitude. Her history, her translation of the history of George Acropolites serves as a model for this present volume, even if it's a model I can never possibly hope to live up to. I have to call out Michael Engel for his input, his encouragement, Philip Burton for his efforts, for his contributions, helping me to translate the very tedious Greek and Latin papal letters were a constant bane of my existence for a while, and Burton helped me a great deal with that. I'm convinced that popes specifically wrote their letters to confound anyone who might dare to try to read them. It seems to be the goal. They want to make it as incomprehensible as possible. But I'll leave it there because the list of who to thank goes far too long. And I'll open up for questions. How did I do for time? Am I all right?
You did lousy, actually.
I did